Hello and welcome to SNI. I am Surya Gangadharan. China is marking the 70th anniversary of its founding as a communist republic. And there are parades galore in Beijing today and tomorrow, although tomorrow is the big day. And time for us here in India to look at the India-China narrative and try and flesh out what is it about China that makes it so intimidating and so powerful and so impressive too. I have with me Professor B.R. Deepak of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's a linguist, he's a specialist in China studies, he's adept at the Mandarin language, he studied it for many years, and he writes frequently on India-China issues. Professor Deepak, welcome and thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
The narrative you get in India about China is uniformly negative. Is this fair? Does it actually reflect what is happening between us?
Not exactly, I would say that it is from both sides, In fact, back in 2017, post-Doklam, Global Times, which has now been read by various people in this country. So they had one annual conference and I was one of the speakers in the annual conference, and, working language was Chinese, so that's why they must have invited me. And there was heated discussion, and the anchor, he intervened and he turned to me, Professor Deepak, so what is your view on this? I said, you see, so China looks down upon India, and India doesn't think big of China. This paradigm, from both the sides, it is problematic. And there may be some truth in this, how these kind of approaches they have formulated, on both sides of the border, but essentially they remain problematic. So one, why, China looks down upon India, it is, I believe we have to go back in history, especially the modern periods, So during the modern periods, when we were under British, that time, the kind of Chinese people, so they came to India, so they made a narrative where they thought that India was an impoverished country. Indian people, so they were not fit to fight the British subjugation. And it was sort of like shadow country, and we should not be looking at a country which cannot fight for its own survival. And these were images, including their, famous writer Lu Xun. So he had similar narrative, about India, and he even criticizes Tagore as a poisonous datura. Nothing to learn from India, and I think these images they were carried on, to the People's Republic of China, and People's Republic of China, during its initial years, especially when we were talking about suzerainty versus sovereignty issue. And that, I think, also deepened, these kind of perceptions in the minds of the Chinese people. And I think we had some opportunities during, say, 50s and even 70s to resolve some of our differences. But somehow I believe we lost those opportunities. And in the last 40 years, especially, since the reforms, so China has made tremendous, achievements. I would say that, it is, only one country which has achieved so much, in the history of mankind in the shortest possible time, sustaining a growth rate of 9%, for 40 long years. It is extremely impressive. And that is how, today's China, so when it compares India, it compares its GDP, which is 5 times larger than India. It compares its defense spending, which is again 5 times more than us. It compares its human index indicators, which are way ahead us, whether it is education, higher education, top ranking of their universities, you can say social welfare, so on and so forth. I mean, these are some of the indicators, I think, the approaches with which they formulated about India during the modern history of India and China relations. And then, by this, you can say, humongous achievement which they made during the last 40 years. So the gap, it has widened to such an extent so that there is a feeling, in Chinese people, so that we are much, much ahead of, India. But I think perception, again, that's what I said, that, India doesn't think big of in China, That is also a problem in that paradigm. Because I think when we talk about our civilizational context with China, undoubtedly, India influenced it in big way, whether it was our literature, whether it was our astronomy, our mathematics, our ideas, even technology, whether sugar making technology, so on. So China learned it from us. But I think, this kind of image, it is extremely deep-rooted in the Indian mindset and believes that we were always stronger spiritually than China, and we can still, beat them as far as spiritualism is concerned. But I think during modern period also, because of maybe our connections with the British, our forces going into China, suppressing the Chinese rebellions and popular movements, that also, is the part of the problem, So, the problem of, looking down upon and not thinking big about the other, both are problematic. I think we should move away from these paradigms and realistically and constructively think about, what is doable, because China should not believe that India is a banana republic. It is a small country, as we have in the periphery. It is a big country. It is one of the emerging poles of economic growth in the world. And there is a consensus, not only within India, but outside, that within a decade, we are going to be the third largest economy in the world. So China, I think to some extent, they have also started to take us seriously. And that's how we find, Chinese enterprises making their ways to India in a big way.
Now, when you talk to Chinese scholars, I was at a meeting of Chinese and Indian scholars recently, and I recall one of them saying that China does not regard India as a strategic competitor. Now, from what you have told me, there is a recognition in China that we could be a power maybe in a decade or so. But they would still like to leverage whatever power they have now to try and keep us down or at a disadvantage. How does this actually work out? Do you think they really believe we are not a competitor, or somewhere down the line there is a sense that we are a danger perhaps?
I think, as far as current situation is concerned, and given the comprehensive national strength of both the countries, China really doesn't believe that we are the real competitor at this point in time. Okay. I think all their energies, they are channelized towards United States. So United States has been designated as enemy number one and the competitor number one, which I believe under present circumstances is also maybe understandable, because China has emerged as the only challenger, to the existing hegemon, so that is United States of America. So their defense capabilities, even their economic orientation and the global economic dynamics, so they are, revolving around this perception. And we would have, no doubt, when we interpret their Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah. So it is also, one of the, you can say, measures to check, or I would rather say that it is a preemptive surgical strike on the American deglobalization, American protectionism, and American nativism. And China trying to, take a global stage and trying to dislodge United States narrative, from not only the region, that is Asia Pacific, but also all over the globe. And that is how we will see that, so China is increasingly taking a center stage as far as geopolitics and geoeconomics at global stage is concerned. And BRI is just one of the indicators of that.
Have we correctly read the Chinese, and how do you see the manner in which we are trying to counter them?
I think we have not. I would simply say we have not, because we have not built the kind of capacity we should have done in order to understand China. For example, our understanding of China's foreign policy, understanding of China's strategic affairs, understanding of China's civilization, culture, so on and so forth, it is extremely shaky, because I believe that China studied in this country, they started pretty late. Even if Tagore founded Vishwavarti in 1921 and China studies were initiated, but the discourse primarily it was civilizational. So it was only after the 1962 conflict that we started to lay emphasis on China's foreign policy, its defense, and so on and so forth. And even now, we have not built the kind of capacity we should have been building. For example, I also do a bit of translation, what Chinese scholars they're doing about India. And you won't believe that major mainstream Indian literature, it has been long translated into Chinese. Everything, from Ramayana, Mahabharata, Mad Bhagavad Gita, Suradas, Ramcharitmanas, Sursagar, and Tulsidas, this Ramcharit Manas, including even today, the subaltern literature, which we find. So it all has been translated into Chinese. And if I compare, because I am engaged in some of the projects, with Ministry of External Affairs, and one of them is a translation of Chinese classics and modern and contemporary works into Hindi. So we have selected just 25, and this is just started off now. So I think before we, we have a correct understanding of China, we need to have a correct understanding of Chinese civilization, Chinese history, Chinese foreign policy, Chinese defense, and various facets of socio-cultural problems which exist inside in China. But the problem of Indian China scholar is that we don't have direct access to these areas or these domains because of the language and whatever is available with us. So we try to take a circuitous route either through Europe or through America, which I think is not a proper way to understand China. Essentially, we are, I think, creating sort of like lopsided understanding of China if we are taking a third eye route in.
So based on what you've just told me, how do you read our policy towards China, the measures that we take with them, against them, what is your reading of, how do you analyze it?
I think, as far as security environment, between India and China is concerned, to be very frank, so it has improved a great deal. Right from the first confidence building measure, I will say, 1954, when we signed, the first agreement, it is also known as, this Panchashila, 1954. So that was, I would say, that first, confidence building measure or crisis management mechanism, between India and China, and followed by then, series, of course, after the conflict, there was the deep freeze, and then, from 1988 onward, JWG, and then, a series of confidence building in 93, 96, 2005, 2012, so on and so forth. So I think these measures, to some extent, so they have stabilized, our borders with China, even though there are, incursions or transgressions, and I believe they are from the both sides, because we are not clear about, the LAC, line of actual control, and the perception. So they are essentially different, But having said that, I think these measures, so they are, I would say, we are managing our, differences. We are not trying to resolve them, We are just controlling and managing them to a certain extent, and that is why, so we have certain stability. But as soon as the relationship deteriorates, if there is another transgression, then
everything goes up.
It goes up. For example, in Doklam, before that, during President Xi Jinping's visit in 2014, like in Chumar sector and in Daulat Beg Oldi, So I mean, these are, I think, some of the measures which are only controlling and managing our differences in. So what should be doing is, rather than controlling, we should be finding a long-lasting solution.
So I just want to ask you here, there is a perception in India that China is not interested in resolving anything because they don't see us as a competitor and therefore we are not quite relevant and therefore whatever. So is that a correct perception?
I think at this point in time, maybe yes, because China, given the asymmetrical relationship, with India, naturally, so they are at the higher up position and they would not like to lose the ground. So in fact, I would say that, we had a couple of opportunities which we didn't encash. The last one, being the 1979-80, when they again talked about the package deal, and we didn't even bother to ask them for the explanation. So what they meant by the package deal, how do they interpret the package deal? Rather, we adopted this sectoral, way of resolving the water problem, which is extremely difficult. I mean, we would also lose bargaining power. And Chinese, they will also lose bargaining power if we try to adopt sectoral approach, toward the resolution of the border. So I believe even now, the only way out to resolve, especially the border problem, which is the most or the core of the core problem as far as India-China relations are concerned. Though our security boundary has sprawled into various, other areas, including the rivers, including the maritime security, counterterrorism, so on and so forth, including multilateral cooperation. But I think the border problem is the crux. And the only way to resolve this problem is still the package deal. And I believe, some of the Chinese, in fact, one of their former ambassadors, he was ambassador in India. So according to him, in one of his articles, of course, is written in Chinese. So he categorically explains what the package deal is and how we should be resolving it. And according to this article, which of course was written in early 90s, that time the equations were different. So he says that it should be the swap. For example, India should keep 90,000 square kilometers of the land in eastern sector and China 35,000 square kilometers of land in the western sector. He explains categorically, and there is no, giving away Tawang in that package deal. I think we should have, gone back to these writing, but I don't know how many people they have access to what, Ambassador Chung at that time wrote.
So last question, in the absence of any deal, and you're saying India is just managing this relationship, do you foresee a time when perhaps another Doklam-like thing could recur?
I think the possibility is always there, because LSE is not defined, and LSE is quite grey, because our perception there, perceptions that differ, and especially if you see the kind of infrastructure development, which is taking place on the Chinese side of the border, whether it is western sector or middle sector, or especially nowadays eastern sector. And if you believe on these reports, the Chinese, they have even come inside Indian territory in eastern sector also, which was not heard of. So the possibility of Doklam-like, standoffs it remains. But I think at the same time, at this point in time, I think India has a sort of like advantageous position given its standing in the region and the global, the global dynamics, the way they are unfolding. For example, China's equations with the United States, they are deteriorating, and I don't think Trump is responsible for that. There are a whole lot of issues. Any American president, so he would have taken the similar steps what Trump is taking, and the way the China is challenging the U.S. hegemony or say called the established international order. So any American president would go in that direction. So I think we need to encash these equations to our advantage, and maybe if the China feels that it cannot take so much from every direction, and that is the time when they may conclude an agreement what is for the liking of both of us.
Professor Deepak, on that note, thank you very much.
You are most welcome.